The grand ballroom shimmered with golden lights, casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed guests. Laughter and the soft clinking of champagne glasses filled the air as a string quartet played a delicate melody in the background. It was the perfect wedding, every detail meticulously planned, from the flower arrangements to the towering wedding cake that stood proudly in the corner. The bride, radiant in a flowing white gown, stood hand in hand with the groom, their eyes locked in a moment of pure happiness. Everything was flawless, until the doors at the back of the hall creaked open. At first, no one paid much attention. The guests were too engrossed in their conversations, their glasses of wine, and the speeches that were being delivered with practiced ease. But as the heavy doors swung open wider, a few heads turned, and then a few more. The music didn't stop, but the energy in the room shifted ever so slightly. Like a whisper passing through the crowd, a man stood at the entrance. His clothes were tattered, his face lined with the marks of hardship, and his eyes, deep and searching, held a quiet intensity. He wasn't invited, he didn't belong, yet there he was, standing amidst the grandeur, a stark contrast to the polished perfection of the evening. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Who was he? How did he get in? Security must have been distracted, or maybe someone had held the door open for too long. Whatever the reason, he was here now. The man took a slow step forward, his worn-out shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. His hands trembled slightly as he looked around the room, as if searching for something, someone. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to call for help or let things unfold. The bride's father, a stern-looking man with salt and pepper hair, leaned toward the groom and whispered something. The groom frowned, his jaw tightening. The bride, however, stared at the man with a curious expression, her fingers tightening around her bouquet. Then, before anyone could stop him, the man did something that no one expected. He walked straight to the center of the room. He didn't grab food or ask for monies. He didn't cause a scene. He simply stopped in front of the crowd, took a deep breath, and in a voice that was rough yet steady, he began to speak. The entire room fell silent. Even the waitstaff froze. Trays of champagne poised in midair. The band, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, let their instruments go still. All eyes were on him. The tension was thick, heavy with uncertainty. Who was this man? What could he possibly have to say? And then, in words that carried both sorrow and strength, he began to tell his story. The man cleared his throat, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on him. But he didn't falter. His voice, though rough from the wear of time, carried through the grand hall with an eerie calmness. "I know I don't belong here," he began, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I know you're all wondering why I walked in, why I'm interrupting such a beautiful night, but I had to be here. I had to say something." The murmurs among the guests grew louder. Some shifted in their seats. Others glanced toward the wedding planner, expecting security to step in at any moment. But no one moved. There was something about the man's voice, something raw and filled with emotion, that held everyone in place. Even the bride and groom remained frozen, their hands still clasped together, their breaths shallow. "I wasn't always like this," the man continued, motioning toward his ragged clothes and the dirt on his hands. "I had a home once, a family, a life that made sense. And then, one by one, I lost it all. Sometimes life has a way of knocking you down so hard, you don't even know how to get back up." His voice wavered, just for a second. And in that moment, something changed in the room. The discomfort that had filled the space moments ago started shifting into something else. Curiosity, maybe even sympathy. The guests, dressed in their finest, had come to celebrate love, to toast to a perfect future. Yet here stood a man who had lost everything, bearing his soul before them. I wouldn't be here tonight if it wasn't for her. His gaze landed on the bride. A sharp breath escaped her lips. The room collectively tensed. A few guests turned their heads toward the bride, their expressions puzzled. The groom's grip on her hand tightened, but she didn't react. She was staring at the man, her eyes wide, searching his face, as if trying to place a memory that had long been buried. The man smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "You don't recognize me, do you?" The bride didn't answer, but something flickered in her expression. A hint of something distant, a thread of something long forgotten. "I shouldn't be surprised," the man continued, nodding to himself. "It's been years, and time has a way of changing people, doesn't it?" He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "But I remember you. I remember everything." The silence in the hall was suffocating now. The guests who had once been eager to see the man removed were now fully invested, caught in the middle of a story they hadn't expected. The groom finally spoke, his voice sharp. "Who are you?" The man's gaze flicked to him briefly, before returning to the bride. "My name is Daniel." He let the name hang in the air, waiting for a reaction. The bride's breath hitched. The color drained from her face. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "That's not possible." The groom looked between them, confusion and suspicion clouding his face. "You know him." The bride swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she slowly lowered her bouquet. I used to." A fresh wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just a random homeless man. This wasn't some stranger who had stumbled into the wrong place. The man, Daniel, nodded, his face etched with something between sorrow and relief. "You were just a kid when I last saw you," he said, "but I never forgot you." Tears welled in the bride's eyes. "But they told me you were gone. They told me you—" She stopped herself, as if saying the words out loud would make them real. The tension in the room was unbearable now. The groom stepped closer to his bride, protectively, but his eyes were filled with questions. "What is he talking about?" Daniel exhaled slowly. He knew this moment was coming, and yet, it didn't make it any easier. "I was your brother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your real brother." The entire room seemed to gasp at once. A few guests covered their mouths. Others exchanged stunned glances. The bride staggered back a step, shaking her head in disbelief. No, that can't be. My brother, my real brother, died when I was a child." Daniel's eyes darkened, and for the first time, anger flickered beneath his calm exterior. "That's what they told you," he said, his voice laced with pain. But it was a lie. Tears brimmed in the bride's eyes, as memories she had buried deep within her heart clawed their way to the surface. She had been so young. She remembered shadows of a different life, of laughter that had faded too soon, of a boy who had once held her hand when she was scared. But those memories had been replaced with something else, stories of loss, of grief, of a brother who had never made it past childhood. The groom looked between them, his patience thinning. "What are you saying? That her family lied to her?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He turned to the guests, to the people who had once known his family, though they had long forgotten him. "They didn't just lie," he said. "They erased me." A heavy silence settled over the hall. The weight of his words sank deep into the bones of those listening. Daniel's gaze returned to his sister, the woman who had once been the little girl he had promised to protect. "I was taken away," he said, "thrown into a system that never meant to keep me. I spent years trying to come back, but by the time I did, I was already gone from your world." The bride's hands trembled. But why? Why would they do that? Daniel's lips pressed together. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to shatter the world she had built for herself. But the truth had waited long enough. Because I wasn't their real son, he said. I was adopted. And when things got too hard, when I wasn't perfect enough, they gave me back. The bride's breath left her in a shudder. No! The guests were deathly silent now. Some looked away, unable to meet Daniel's eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably, as if the weight of the truth was too heavy to bear. Daniel's voice was quieter now, but no less powerful. I never came to ruin your day, he said, looking at her with the love of a brother who had never stopped caring. I came because I needed you to know. I needed you to hear it from me. The bride's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. Her world, so carefully constructed, was cracking at the edges, and for the first time, she wasn't sure what to do. And then, before she could say a word, before she could even process the truth, Daniel turned. He started walking back toward the doors, the weight of his story finally off his shoulders. And in that moment, as the guests watched him go, one question hung in the air, unspoken, yet deafening. Would she let him leave? The room was silent, except for the sound of Daniel's footsteps as he walked toward the doors. No one moved, no one spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. The bride stood frozen, her bouquet trembling in her hands, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She had spent her whole life believing a story that was never true. The loss she had mourned as a child, the older brother she thought had died, had been alive all along, forgotten, cast aside, erased, and now he was leaving. Again, something in her broke. Wait, her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it stopped him. Daniel's steps faltered, his shoulders tensed. Slowly he turned back, his tired eyes meeting hers. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Please don't go. The entire room seemed to exhale, the tension breaking just slightly. The groom, still gripping her hand, glanced at her, his face full of questions, but he didn't stop her. Daniel hesitated, his expression unreadable. He had been ready to walk away, to disappear once more. He had told his truth, that was all. He had come to do. He never expected anything more. But now, looking at her, seeing the way she was shaking, the way her face was filled with something between grief and hope, he realized something. She wanted to know him. He swallowed hard, his voice softer now. Are you sure? She nodded, wiping her tears quickly, as if afraid he might vanish if she hesitated. I don't know everything yet. I don't know why they did what they did. But I know one thing. She took a shaky breath. You're my brother, and I'm not losing you again. Daniel's lips parted slightly, his breath unsteady. He had spent years trying to accept that he was alone, that his family had chosen to forget him. He had convinced himself that no one was looking for him, that no one even remembered his name. And now, in a room full of strangers, in the middle of a wedding that wasn't his to interrupt, his sister, the little girl he had once loved more than anything, was reaching for him. His throat tightened, but he gave a small nod. Okay. A choked laugh escaped her, a sound mixed with relief and disbelief. She turned to the groom, her eyes pleading. I need to talk to him. The groom hesitated, but then, with a slow nod, he let go of her hand. She didn't waste another second. In 3 quick steps, she crossed the distance between them and threw her arms around Daniel. For a moment, he didn't move. He was too stunned, too overwhelmed. But then, slowly, his arms came up around her, holding her like he had all those years ago, before everything had been taken away. The guests watched in stunned silence. Some had tears in their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. But one thing was clear. The wedding wasn't the most important thing that had happened that night. Family had been found. Daniel pulled back just enough to look at her. "I don't have much," he admitted. "I don't even know where I belong anymore." She shook her head, still holding onto his arms. "You belong with me." He let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob. "I never thought I'd hear you say that." A small teary smile broke across her face. "Then it's about time, isn't it?" Daniel nodded, and for the first time in years, he felt something warm inside him. A sense of belonging, a sense of home. The guests didn't clap. There was no grand applause, no dramatic cheers, but there didn't need to be. The moment was enough. The bride turned back toward her husband-to-be, her eyes still shining with emotion. He smiled at her, a look of quiet understanding on his face. He didn't have to say anything. She knew he supported her. Then, for the first time since the night had begun, she felt like this wedding, this moment, was exactly as it was meant to be, with her brother by her side,